The neighborhood looked calm and peaceful from the outside. It had wide streets lined with tall green trees, well-kept lawns, and houses that all looked almost the same, as if they had been copied and pasted next to one another. Families who lived there often said they loved the quiet and safety that came with the place. It was the kind of community where children could ride their bikes on the sidewalks, neighbors waved politely when they saw each other, and everything seemed in order. At least, that was how it looked from a distance. But behind the picture-perfect setting, there was a different kind of atmosphere. The community was controlled by a homeowners association, usually called the HOA. The HOA had many rules, and everyone who lived there had to follow them. From how short your grass should be cut to the color of paint you could put on your door, everything was decided and monitored by the HOA. And the man who led it, the president, was known for his strictness. His name was Mr. Carter. He had been the HOA president for years, and he enjoyed the power that came with the title. People said he cared more about rules than people. He was always watching, always checking, and always pointing out things that he thought did not fit his idea of what the neighborhood should be. Some neighbors feared him, some quietly disliked him, but no one wanted to get on his bad side. He had a way of making life hard for anyone who did not listen to him. When a new family moved into one of the houses on the corner, many neighbors were curious. The Johnson family was warm, polite, and friendly. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson had moved there hoping to give their only son, a bright and cheerful boy named Marcus, a safe and peaceful place to grow up. They wanted him to have friends to play with and streets where he could ride his bike without worry. At first, everything seemed fine. Marcus loved his new home. He would play outside with his basketball, ride his scooter along the sidewalk, and wave happily to anyone who passed by. Some neighbors smiled back, and a few even came over to welcome the family with small gifts. But others simply watched in silence, unsure of what to make of the new family. Mr. Carter, the HOA president, was one of the people who did not welcome them. He noticed every little thing the Johnsons did, as if he was waiting for them to make a mistake. He would drive slowly past their house, stopping sometimes just to look at the yard or the porch. He would stand at community meetings and make little comments about new families needing to understand the rules. The Johnsons noticed the stares, but they tried not to let it bother them. Mrs. Johnson often told Marcus, "Don't worry about people who don't smile back. Just keep being you." Marcus nodded, though he sometimes wondered why some neighbors didn't seem to like him. He was only 10 years old, full of energy, and excited about life. He loved playing outdoors, laughing, and dreaming about being a basketball player one day. He was not the type of child who thought about complicated things like neighborhood politics or hidden prejudice. All he wanted was to be a kid. As weeks passed, Marcus began to use the small community park more often. It was a grassy area with a bench and a few trees, a place where kids usually gathered. Marcus enjoyed dribbling his basketball there, shooting imaginary hoops, and making up little games for himself. Some other kids joined him occasionally, and he was always kind and welcoming. But Mr. Carter noticed. To him, everything Marcus did seemed like a disturbance. He complained about the sound of the bouncing basketball. He muttered about kids running around the park. He even told other neighbors that rules about the use of community spaces had to be enforced more strictly. What Mr. Carter did not realize or perhaps chose to ignore was that his behavior was being noticed. Some neighbors began to whisper among themselves, wondering why he seemed to have such a problem with one child playing outside. They knew the Johnsons were not causing trouble. They paid their dues, kept their yard neat, and followed the community rules. Yet, the HOA president was constantly finding reasons to complain. The Johnsons did their best to stay calm. Mr. Johnson, a man with a calm and steady personality, often reminded his wife that not everyone would welcome them right away, but time would make things better. Mrs. Johnson, though hurt by the coldness of some neighbors, focused on making their house feel like home for Marcus. Still, Marcus sometimes asked questions that broke her heart. "Mom," he said one evening, "why doesn't Mr. Carter like me? I didn't do anything wrong." Mrs. Johnson hugged him tightly and said softly, "Sometimes people don't understand others who are different. But you just keep being kind and strong. That's what matters." Marcus nodded, but deep down, he was confused. He wanted to believe his mother's words, but he could feel the difference in how some people treated him. Meanwhile, Mr. Carter grew more restless. He believed the Johnsons did not belong in his neighborhood. He told himself he was only protecting the rules, but in truth, he was letting his own dislike take control. Each time he saw Marcus playing, he felt annoyed. Each time he heard the sound of that basketball, his frustration grew. The stage was being set for something that would soon shock the whole neighborhood. No one could have guessed how far Mr. Carter's bitterness would go. No one could have imagined how a simple afternoon of play would turn into a story that the entire nation would hear about. For now, the Johnsons carried on with their daily lives, unaware of how close they were to a storm. Marcus kept smiling, his basketball always at his side. His parents kept hoping that with time, things would settle. But the truth was, the quiet neighborhood was not as peaceful as it seemed. Beneath the tidy lawns and polite waves, tensions were growing. And it would only take one heated moment for everything to spill out into the open. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when the moment that would change everything began. The sun was bright, the streets were quiet, and most families were enjoying their weekend in the comfort of their homes. Marcus, however, was outside in the little community park. He had brought his favorite basketball and was practicing dribbling across the grass. For him, this park was a place of joy. It gave him the freedom to run, laugh, and pretend he was playing in a big stadium with thousands of fans cheering for him. He was focused, his small hands tapping the ball against the ground rhythmically. He counted the number of times he could bounce it without losing control. 1, 2, 3, 4, his voice carried happily through the air. Occasionally, he would throw the ball high and try to catch it again, laughing at himself when it slipped through his fingers. Some of the neighborhood kids passed by on their bikes. A few waved at Marcus, and he waved back with a wide smile. He wanted friends and hoped that soon, the other kids would join him more often. But even when he was alone, Marcus never felt bored. His imagination filled the silence with games, cheers, and little victories that made him feel proud. What Marcus did not know was that Mr. Carter, the HOA president, was watching him from his porch not far away. Mr. Carter's face tightened every time he heard the sound of the basketball hitting the ground. In his mind, the park was not meant to be used this way. He believed children should not disturb the peace with their games. But underneath all his excuses, there was something else, an attitude that made him see Marcus differently from the other children in the neighborhood. As the minutes passed, Mr. Carter's frustration grew. He muttered to himself about rules and order, convincing himself that he had the right to interfere. He stood up, straightened his shirt, and walked toward the park with a determined stride. Marcus was too busy playing to notice him at first. He had just made a pretend shot and shouted, "Yes. 3 points," when he suddenly heard a sharp voice call out his name. "Hey, boy." Marcus froze and turned. His small smile faded when he saw Mr. Carter approaching with a stern expression. Marcus clutched his basketball closer to his chest, unsure of what to say. Mr. Carter stopped a few feet away and crossed his arms. "You can't play here. This park is not your personal playground. Don't you know the rules?" Marcus looked down at the grass and said softly, "I was just playing. I'm not hurting anything." But Mr. Carter didn't want to listen. He raised his voice, making sure anyone nearby could hear. "That's not the point. Rules are rules. If every kid did what you're doing, this place would be a mess." A curtain from a nearby house moved slightly. A neighbor peeked out, drawn by the loud voice. Then another door opened quietly. People were starting to notice. Marcus shuffled his feet nervously. He didn't want trouble. "I'll stop," he whispered. But instead of leaving it at that, Mr. Carter continued. "You'd better. This neighborhood has standards. We don't allow just anything here." His words carried a sharp edge, and though he never said it out loud, the neighbors who watched could sense what he meant. Marcus lowered his head and hugged his basketball. His small shoulders slumped. He was only a child, but in that moment, he felt the heavy weight of being singled out for something he didn't understand. One of the neighbors across the street, Mrs. Green, frowned as she watched. She had always thought Mr. Carter could be too harsh, but now it looked different. She pulled out her phone quietly and began recording, sensing that this was not just an ordinary disagreement. Mr. Carter stepped closer, his voice still raised. "You need to respect this community. I'll be watching you." Marcus bit his lip and nodded. His eyes began to sting, though he tried hard not to cry. He turned slowly and started walking back toward his house, the basketball held tightly under his arm. Every step felt heavier than the last. From behind the curtains and windows, several neighbors watched silently. Some felt uncomfortable but did not want to get involved. Others whispered to each other, wondering why Mr. Carter seemed so angry at a child simply playing. The video on Mrs. Green's phone captured every word, every gesture, and every uncomfortable pause. When Marcus reached his front door, his mother was already there. She had heard the raised voices and had come out to see what was happening. She knelt down and looked at her son's face. His eyes were watery, his cheeks flushed. She hugged him quickly, then looked past him toward the park. Mr. Carter stood there with his arms still crossed, watching them. His expression was firm, as if daring anyone to challenge him. Mrs. Johnson stared back, her heart racing. She wanted to shout, to defend her child, but she also knew she had to stay calm. "Come inside, Marcus," she said softly, guiding him in. Mr. Carter turned and walked away, feeling satisfied. In his mind, he had done his duty as HOA president. He had kept the neighborhood in order. But what he did not realize was that his actions had been witnessed and recorded. The video was already being shared with a few friends of Mrs. Green, and within hours, it would spread beyond the neighborhood. People would see not only the strictness of an HOA president but the unfairness of an adult targeting a child. Inside the Johnsons' home, Marcus sat quietly at the kitchen table. He kept his basketball close, but he didn't bounce it anymore. Mrs. Johnson stroked his hair and tried to comfort him. "You did nothing wrong," she whispered. "Don't let anyone make you feel small." Mr. Johnson came home a short while later and listened as his wife explained what had happened. He looked at his son, then at his wife, and his jaw tightened. He was a calm man by nature, but this incident cut deeply. He knew this was not just about a rule in a park, something bigger was at play. As the family talked quietly, their phones began to buzz. Friends and relatives were already calling after seeing the video online. Messages of support started pouring in, and with them came the beginning of a wave that would soon crash into their neighborhood. For Marcus, it had been just another day of play turned sour. For Mr. Carter, it was a show of authority. But for everyone who would soon see the video, it was something far more serious. The incident that started as a small clash in a quiet park was about to grow into a storm far larger than anyone expected. The Johnson household was quiet that evening, but it was not the kind of peaceful quiet that comes with rest. It was the heavy silence of worry. Marcus sat on the couch with his basketball on his lap, his small fingers tracing the lines on its surface. His parents sat nearby, exchanging glances filled with unspoken words. They could see how much the incident had affected their son. Mrs. Johnson's phone buzzed again. She picked it up and saw yet another message from a neighbor: "This video is spreading fast. People are talking about it online." She sighed and showed it to her husband. Mr. Johnson leaned forward, studying the video. It was clear, every word of Mr. Carter's harsh tone, every fearful look on Marcus's face, and every uncomfortable silence captured perfectly. Anyone watching could see that this was not simply about rules. It carried something deeper, something troubling. Mrs. Johnson placed her hand over her husband's. "People are asking us to speak out," she said softly. "They want us to make a statement." Mr. Johnson stayed quiet for a moment. He was a man who valued privacy. For years, he had worked in one of the most demanding and high-stakes jobs in the country, but he had always made sure his family lived as normally as possible. Marcus had no idea how important his father's position really was. To him, his dad was just dad, the man who tucked him in at night, cheered for him at small basketball games, and grilled burgers on the weekends. But now, Mr. Johnson realized that his carefully built wall of privacy might have to come down. That night, Marcus finally broke his silence. "Dad," he said in a quiet voice, "why did Mr. Carter yell at me? Did I do something wrong?" Mr. Johnson leaned over and pulled his son into his arms. "You did nothing wrong," he said firmly. "You were just being a kid. What happened today wasn't about you. It was about someone else's heart not being in the right place." Marcus nodded slowly, though he didn't fully understand. He rested his head against his father's chest, comforted by his steady heartbeat. Meanwhile, outside their walls, the video continued to spread. What had started as a neighborhood recording soon reached wider audiences. Social media picked it up, and discussions began. Some people saw it as yet another example of unfair treatment, while others defended Mr. Carter, saying he was just doing his job as HOA president. The debate grew louder by the hour. By the next morning, the Johnson family's phones were filled with notifications. News reporters were calling. Journalists wanted interviews. Neighbors were whispering in hushed tones. Mr. Johnson knew it was time to make a choice. He looked at his wife and said, "We can't stay silent. They need to know who we are." Mrs. Johnson nodded, though her eyes carried worry. "Are you sure? Once you do this, there's no going back." He took a deep breath. "It's time." Later that day, Mr. Johnson made a phone call that very few people in the neighborhood could have ever imagined. He contacted his office in Washington, where his colleagues knew him not as just another neighbor but as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. The news broke within hours. Headlines appeared online: "Child attacked in HOA dispute is son of FBI director." Television anchors repeated the story again and again, each time with more detail. The video was replayed on national news, showing Mr. Carter's sharp words and Marcus's downcast face. The reaction was immediate. Suddenly, this was not just a story about a strict HOA president and a child with a basketball. It was about power, prejudice, and justice. People across the country began asking questions: how could a child be treated this way? What kind of leadership allowed this? In the neighborhood, the atmosphere changed overnight. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now came forward. Some admitted they had felt uneasy about Mr. Carter's leadership for years. Others confessed that they had seen moments of unfairness but had been too afraid to speak up. Now, with the truth out in the open, they felt emboldened. Mr. Carter, however, remained stubborn. He walked around the neighborhood as if nothing had changed, though whispers followed him wherever he went. He told anyone who would listen that he had simply been enforcing rules and that the media was blowing things out of proportion. But deep down, he began to realize the ground beneath him was shifting. At the Johnson house, things were no less overwhelming. Reporters stood at the edges of the neighborhood, hoping for a glimpse of the family. Letters of support poured in from across the country. Civil rights groups reached out, offering help and encouragement. Marcus watched all of this with wide eyes. He didn't fully understand why his dad's job mattered so much, but he could see the change around him. People were no longer ignoring what had happened. They were standing up, speaking out, and supporting him in ways he had never imagined. One evening, as the family sat together, Marcus asked, "Dad, why didn't you tell me before about your job?" Mr. Johnson smiled gently. "Because I wanted you to grow up like every other kid. I didn't want you to feel different. But now, the world knows. And while it brings a lot of attention, it also means people will see the truth of what happened to you." Marcus thought about this for a while. He finally nodded. If it helps other kids, then maybe it's okay. His parents exchanged a proud glance. Their son, though still so young, was beginning to see the bigger picture. Meanwhile, federal investigators arrived quietly in the neighborhood. They weren't there just because Marcus was the director's son. They were there because the situation demanded it. A community leader had overstepped in a way that touched deeper issues of fairness and treatment. And now, the nation was watching. For Mr. Carter, the realization hit slowly. First, it was the neighbors who no longer greeted him. Then it was the empty seats at HOA meetings, once filled with people who respected his authority but were now avoiding him. Finally, it was the knock at his door, officials arriving with questions he could no longer brush aside. What had started with a basketball in a park was now unraveling his years of influence. And for Marcus, the boy at the center of it all, life would never be quite the same. He was still the same cheerful, basketball-loving kid, but he now carried a story bigger than himself, a story that revealed truths hidden in plain sight, a story that would soon reach every corner of the nation. The story was no longer just a neighborhood issue. By the time the new week began, it had reached television screens, radios, and newspapers across the country. The video of Marcus being scolded in the park was replayed again and again. People paused to watch the small boy clutching his basketball, his eyes lowered as Mr. Carter's voice rang out over him. Each time it aired, hearts ached, and questions rose. Why had a grown man treated a child this way? Why had no one stepped in sooner? And most of all, how had this been allowed to happen under the watch of a community leader? The headlines were sharp: HOA president under fire after confrontation with child. Victim turns out to be FBI director's son. Within hours, public opinion began to turn like a tide. Civil rights organizations called for accountability. Local community groups held small gatherings near the neighborhood, holding signs that read "Let kids be kids" and "Fairness for all families." The Johnson family received countless letters and messages of support, some from people they had never met, some from families who had faced similar struggles but never had the chance to be heard. At first, Marcus didn't quite understand the weight of it all. To him, the news felt too big, too far away. He only knew that people were talking about him everywhere, and that his father was suddenly busier than ever with phone calls and meetings. He wondered why a simple game of basketball had caused such a wave. His mother explained gently, "Sometimes it takes one small spark for people to notice a bigger problem. You were that spark, sweetheart." In the neighborhood itself, the atmosphere shifted completely. Once quiet streets were now filled with murmurs and uneasy glances. Neighbors who had stayed silent during the confrontation began to feel guilty. They realized they had witnessed something wrong and had done nothing. Some of them started coming to the Johnsons' house with words of apology and kindness. "I should have spoken up that day," one woman confessed, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry I didn't." Mr. Johnson listened politely, accepting the apologies with grace, but he also reminded people that silence had consequences. "It's not enough to feel uncomfortable," he said softly. "We all have to do better, together." Meanwhile, Mr. Carter found himself under a spotlight he had never imagined. He had always enjoyed the power of being HOA president. He had loved being the man people came to for approvals and permissions, the one who decided what was acceptable. But now, instead of respect, he was receiving letters demanding his resignation. At the grocery store, people avoided his gaze. At community meetings, neighbors sat far from him, whispering about the investigation that was surely coming. Even his closest allies on the HOA board began to step back, worried that being connected to him would damage their own reputations. Still, Mr. Carter held his ground. He told anyone who would listen, "I was only enforcing the rules. This is being blown out of proportion." But his voice no longer carried the weight it once had. People no longer believed him. The video had spoken louder than his excuses ever could. Not long after, federal investigators arrived in the community. They were professional, calm, and serious. They went door to door, speaking with neighbors and asking questions. They collected statements, gathered details, and reviewed the evidence carefully. Every word Mr. Carter had spoken in that park was analyzed. Every reaction from witnesses was taken into account. For Marcus, the investigation was confusing. He saw people in suits coming to his home, talking to his parents in low voices, writing notes, and thanking them before leaving. He asked his dad one night, "Are they here to protect us?" His father nodded. "Yes, son. They're here to make sure what happened is understood. They're here to make things right." News crews began gathering at the edges of the neighborhood, careful not to cross private property lines but eager for updates. Reporters spoke into cameras with serious faces, explaining the situation to viewers across the country. Words like accountability, prejudice, and justice became part of every report. The nation was watching, and that meant the pressure was growing. Inside his own home, Mr. Carter felt the weight of it. His phone rang constantly, but the calls were no longer friendly. Instead, they came from officials, lawyers, and angry residents. His once confident stride around the neighborhood was now replaced by hurried steps and worried glances. For the first time, he was the one who felt watched. At the next HOA meeting, the tension reached its peak. The room was packed with residents, more than ever before. People wanted answers. The Johnson family did not attend. They had no interest in a shouting match, but their presence was felt in every word spoken. One neighbor stood up, her voice shaking but firm. "This is not about rules anymore. This is about how we treat each other. A child was humiliated in front of all of us, and we let it happen. We cannot keep pretending nothing is wrong." Applause filled the room. Other residents followed, each speaking about their discomfort, their guilt, and their demand for change. By the end of the meeting, it was clear, Mr. Carter could no longer lead. A motion for his removal was passed, and though he resisted, the votes spoke louder than his protests. His position as HOA president was slipping away. But the story did not stop there. National conversations began to blossom from this small neighborhood incident. Talk shows discussed the role of community leaders, the hidden biases in everyday life, and the importance of standing up for what is right. People shared their own stories online, inspired by Marcus's courage and the strength of his family. Through it all, Marcus slowly regained his smile. He began to play with his basketball again, though this time, he noticed something different. When he dribbled in the park, no one stopped him. Instead, neighbors waved, some even joining him for a few minutes. The same place that had once felt heavy now felt lighter, freer. One afternoon, as Marcus shot his ball into the air and caught it, Mrs. Green, the neighbor who had recorded the video, walked by. She smiled warmly and said, "You're stronger than you know, Marcus. You reminded us all of what really matters." He didn't fully understand, but he felt proud. He had only wanted to play. Yet somehow, that simple desire had opened a conversation far bigger than himself. The investigation continued steadily. Reports were written, decisions were being prepared, and the truth was being documented carefully. For Mr. Carter, each passing day felt like a door closing. For the Johnson family, each day brought a little more healing, a little more hope. The backlash had begun as whispers, but it had grown into something powerful, something unstoppable. The story of one small boy with a basketball had become a symbol of fairness, accountability, and change. And as the nation watched, the next chapter was waiting, the chapter where justice would finally be served. Weeks passed, and the small neighborhood that once seemed like an ordinary suburban community had become a place known across the nation. The video of Marcus in the park had sparked conversations far beyond its streets, and the investigation into Mr. Carter's actions was now complete. Everyone waited to hear what would happen next. The Johnson family tried to live as normally as possible during this time. Marcus still went to school, though his classmates now looked at him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Some whispered, "That's the boy from the news," while others came up to him and said kindly, "You're really brave." At first, Marcus felt shy about all the attention, but over time he realized that people weren't just talking about him, they were talking about what he had gone through, and how important it was that things had changed. At home, life was quieter but different. Letters and messages still arrived daily. Families from all over the country wrote about their own experiences with unfairness, thanking the Johnsons for standing strong. Some parents even wrote that their children felt inspired by Marcus, saying, "Now my son feels like he can be proud of who he is." Mr. Johnson often read these messages aloud at the dinner table, reminding Marcus that his small act of playing basketball had created ripples that touched many lives. Finally, the day of the official announcement came. Federal investigators released their findings, and the local courthouse prepared to share the outcome. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Reporters gathered outside, cameras ready. Neighbors exchanged nervous glances, waiting for the words that would mark the end of the case. When the statement was read, it was clear: Mr. Carter was found guilty of misconduct in his role as HOA president. He was permanently removed from his position and faced legal consequences for his actions. His influence, once so heavy over the community, was gone in an instant. The reaction was swift. Many neighbors felt a sense of relief. They knew the decision was fair, and though it did not erase what had happened, it showed that accountability was possible. Some even admitted openly that they had feared speaking up in the past, but now they felt empowered to never stay silent again. For Mr. Carter, it was the end of an era. The man who had once walked the neighborhood with authority now avoided public spaces. His voice, once loud in meetings, was now absent. The respect he had demanded for years had disappeared, replaced with quiet disapproval from those who once followed his lead. For the Johnsons, however, this moment was not about victory or revenge. It was about closure. They had never wanted fame, nor had they asked for a national spotlight. All they had wanted was for their son to be treated fairly, to be allowed to play like any other child without fear. That evening, the family gathered in their living room. Marcus sat between his parents, holding the basketball that had started it all. His father smiled at him and said, "It's over now, son. Justice has been served." Marcus looked thoughtful. "Does that mean I can play in the park again?" Mrs. Johnson hugged him gently. "Yes, sweetheart. You can play anywhere you like. And no one will ever make you feel small for it again." The next day, Marcus returned to the park. His basketball bounced happily against the ground as he dribbled it back and forth. This time, something was different. Neighbors came out of their homes to watch, but not with judgment or silence. They clapped, they cheered, and some of the other children joined him on the grass. The sound of laughter filled the air, replacing the memory of fear with joy. Mrs. Green, the neighbor who had recorded the original video, walked over with a warm smile. "See, Marcus. You've changed this place. You've reminded all of us what it means to care for one another." Marcus grinned shyly but kept bouncing his ball. For him, this was all he had ever wanted, the simple happiness of playing without worry. In the weeks that followed, the community began to rebuild itself. The HOA was reorganized, this time with leaders chosen who cared more about people than power. Meetings were no longer about enforcing endless rules but about improving the lives of families. Plans for new playground equipment were approved, and neighbors began hosting events to bring everyone together. The atmosphere of fear and control was replaced with a spirit of openness and cooperation. Across the country, Marcus's story continued to inspire. Schools discussed it in classrooms, teaching children about kindness and fairness. Community groups used it as an example of why speaking up matters. And though the Johnsons slowly stepped away from the spotlight, the impact of what had happened remained strong. For Marcus, life settled back into the rhythm of childhood. He focused on school, on playing basketball, and on dreaming big about the future. Sometimes, he would still hear people whisper about the boy from the news, but he no longer felt embarrassed. Instead, he felt proud that his experience had helped others find courage. One quiet evening, Marcus and his father sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Marcus hugged his basketball and asked, "Dad, do you think people will forget what happened?" Mr. Johnson shook his head gently. "No, son. People don't forget stories that open their eyes. They carry them as lessons. And maybe, because of you, another child somewhere won't have to go through the same thing." Marcus smiled at that thought. He didn't want anyone else to feel the way he had felt in that park. If his story could prevent that, then maybe everything had happened for a reason. In the end, the brutal moment that had begun with harsh words and unfair treatment had backfired in the biggest way possible. Instead of silencing a child, it had given him a voice that echoed far and wide. Instead of keeping power in the hands of one man, it had shifted power back to the people, reminding them that leadership should always come with kindness. The Johnson family remained in the neighborhood, not because they had to, but because they chose to. They wanted to prove that they belonged, not just as residents, but as part of a stronger, fairer community. Their presence became a symbol of resilience, their story a reminder that even the smallest act, a boy dribbling a basketball in a park, could spark change across the nation. As Marcus grew, his love for basketball never faded. But alongside his dreams of becoming a player, another dream began to form, a dream of making a difference, of helping others find their courage. And whenever he picked up his ball and walked toward the park, the sound of it bouncing against the ground was no longer just a game. It was a rhythm of hope, a reminder of the lesson the whole world had learned from his story. Justice had been served. The neighborhood had changed. And a little boy had shown everyone that even the smallest voice can carry far, as long as it speaks the truth.